When it was announced that Last Epoch wouldn't have an economy, a lot of people were upset. And in my initial video, I said that an economy acts as the glue which binds players to come back season after season or league after league. Now, two things have changed since I made that video. The first is that 11th Hour Games has announced Last Epoch is going to have a seasonal development called Cycles. And second of all, they've announced their plans to integrate trade and an economy into Last Epoch. But there are some compromises here, and compromises are pretty risky. If you strike the perfect balance, everyone's happy. But you also risk displeasing both sides, in which case you would have been better off making half the people angry, or in the case of something like trade, going with the majority and making the minority angry, than making everyone mad with a compromise. So with that in mind, what is the trade compromise that 11th Hour Games has made, and is this a good direction for Last Epoch? So here we have a trade development update introducing the Merchants Guild and Circle of Fortune, which I'm probably going to be calling Circle of Fortune solo self-found at several points in this video. That's just because I'm used to the terminology from Path of Exile. So first off, there's some talk about the December update. This is what was massively unpopular, because it introduced item gifting as the only form of trading in Last Epoch. In other words, you could trade with your friends, people specifically in a party with you at the moment, but you couldn't trade with a general populace, and there wasn't going to be an economy. Now, it's true there are some people who prefer to play without trading or interacting with an economy. However, a lot of people playing ARPGs, we love our loot, we love trading that loot, buying things that we need, or selling items we don't want. So trade is very much an extremely popular part of a genre, and especially if you have a live service, like I mentioned before, the economy often functions as the glue, keeping people coming back league after league or season after season. So, first up, one thing mentioned here is Last Epoch is a game where you slay monsters for loot first. They don't want it to become a trade house simulator. And as a result, they don't really want trade to be required so much as just an option for the people who enjoy it. There are now two item factions in Iterra: the Merchants Guild, based off of trade, and the Circle of Fortune, based off of finding items for yourself. The Merchants Guild gives you access to the newly revamped Bazaar, think of it similarly to an auction house I'm guessing, whereas the Circle of Fortune gives you better target farming methods. And let's get into this a little bit. First off, you get to pick a faction, and you gain both reputation with that faction and favor to spend on services and rewards. More ranks, better rewards. The Merchants Guild and the Circle of Fortune are the first two factions. This makes me think there's going to be more than two, which might be interesting. And it says, interestingly, each character can only represent one faction at a time. That makes me think that your account isn't locked to it, it's only your character. So you could have one character that is trade-based and one character that isn't. Then you can swap between factions at any time. Equipping items found while in Circle of Fortune will require the ranks of that faction. Equipping items purchased through trade will require Merchants Guild. So if you have two gear sets, you can actually probably freely swap on the same character. And sure enough, different characters in the same cycle with different factions. The rep is account-wide. It resets each cycle. Depending on how hard it is to get, this could end up being a very annoying, grindy chore, much like ranking up Masters was in Path of Exile, or it could be something that just happens as you play the game normally. So here's an example for the Circle of Fortune. You might get Runes of Ascendance, have a 45% chance to be preserved when used on an item that requires at least Circle of Fortune rank 1. Meaning a 45% chance to get a second free Rune of Ascendance, but if you're lucky, that could chain infinitely. And if you're unlucky, you'll have 0 Runes of Ascendance because your friends will have stolen them all. Then some other options are items are more likely to be exalted, and uniques are more likely to have legendary potential. Again, this is the solo self-found. You want to find items on the floor, and you don't want a trade faction. Then they also get into prophecies with favor, which gives you some sort of advantage finding specific items. I'm really curious what this means, if it's finding, say, a specific unique item, or if it's just, hey, you'll find exalted helmets. Then you have a Merchant's Guild, where you can trade set items, unique items, exalted items, but not normal items. I don't know if that's just not something that you get early, or if it's something you get at rank 1. Since this is only 2, 4, and 6, we're seeing a little bit of a slice. Getting into it a little bit more, as you gain more reputation, you will get access to a Bazaar, which it looks like it's pretty much just an auction house. Although crafting materials can't be traded. I'm not sure how I feel about this, because that makes me think I'm going to want to have 2 gear sets and or 2 characters to farm a bunch of materials on Circle of Fortune, but then actually use those materials for the most part on Merchant's Guild stuff. Since it'll all come down to if you can actually get more crafting material drops as Circle of Fortune, or if it's just effects like the Rune of Ascendance preserving them, in which case that pressure isn't there, and that would honestly be the best outcome. Next up, we have the Bazaar Revised, a trade-focused zone. And players will be able to search through stalls of player-listed items. I wonder if this means that you're going to be able to search everything at once, or you'll have a specific selection, like my stall could appear, but my friend, let's just say Jason's stall, you wouldn't be able to find his necessarily. You'd have to try again, maybe exit and re-enter the Bazaar, come back on a different day. That's going to be interesting to find out. Of course, this is a very simple first look. Things are probably subject to change. Then there's item gifting, which is a way to trade with your friends. I think this was a very popular feature, so it's good that it's staying. And then there's something called resonances. Resonances are really interesting, because it means you can gift something to someone that you play with consistently, even if it didn't drop when they were there. I don't know how that'll interact in terms of the faction stuff, whether it will change or remove faction requirements, are there potential abuse cases here, or is it just a matter of, hey, you play with this person a lot, maybe they're your support, you found a really cool thing for their build while they were offline, maybe they had to sleep, maybe they were actually touching grass, don't talk about that too much, but ultimately, now you can trade it with them. And then, thanks to the community, this is why in my trade video I stressed giving constructive feedback. Constructive feedback changes things, and EHG has definitely listened. When your feedback isn't constructive, then odds are you're not changing any minds, and ultimately you're only hurting your own argument. So these systems aren't coming in patch 0.9. That makes sense. So then the FAQ, I haven't read this at all yet. I just opened it earlier, so I'd have it all ready to go. How you balance it? Basically, the goal is to have some asymmetry. Perfect balance isn't possible. That makes sense. But you want to keep it relatively in line so both people have a good experience. If you like trading and you want to be able to play any build you want, then obviously the Merchant's Guild is going to be for you. But if you want to go more of the solo self-found, you find your own items, and if you find a really cool build-enabling item, you build around it, then you should have a relatively easier time doing that with the Circle. Can you play the opposite faction? Yes. Good. Getting into factionism and kind of tribalistic, oh, we're enemies, would not be good for the game at all, so I'm glad we're avoiding that entirely. Next up, interesting one. Can you freely gift items to friends of the opposite faction? Yes, but they won't be able to use it. This, I could see causing some friction with the player base, and I kind of wonder what EHG could do to get around this, because a lot of people are going to play with friends of a different faction, and there's this kind of one-sided sharing going on. Maybe that'll be a topic for a little bit later in the video. Then what happens to your gear? You are required to unequip it, but you still keep it. That's good. I'm assuming the items will just turn red. Will resonances let you gift non-crafting material items? Yes, but it doesn't remove the requirement. And it also doesn't matter which faction you're representing when the resonance drops. Okay, so resonance is faction agnostic, which is good. You have to manually store... Oh, good point. Stored in crafting materials. Cool. That's very good, because otherwise if you play with a bunch of different people, you'll have all these different resonances, and it would be a pain. Are there restrictions on which items can be traded? So it depends on your rank with a Merchant's Guild. Normal, magic, and rare. Okay, that answers my question from before. The reason you can't get it at rank 2, 4, or 6 is because you get it at rank 1. As you advance, you'll be able to trade everything except for crafting materials, and then there's going to be a favor cost. I think this is going to kind of make or break the system, honestly, because a lot of people who love to trade want to trade to skip some of the grind when transitioning builds. Obviously, it's an ARPG. You're going to be grinding. You want to be grinding. But you want to be grinding with a build that feels good rather than a build that feels bad. As long as the favor cost isn't so high that you're stuck grinding with a build that feels bad for a long time, this is fine. If you're stuck with a build that feels bad, then that's honestly going to be a huge problem and break the entire system. Then how do you interact? Asynchronous via the Bazaar. It's probably just an auction house. And person-to-person is mostly intended for trading with friends. Makes sense. I'm glad they have both. How long does it take? This is a really important question. Achieving max rank will likely happen after reaching level 100 if you only rank it up on one character. Faction progress is shared across all characters, so this means they're encouraging alts, but this is going to be quite the grind. That does have me a little worried depending on what rewards are locked behind what tiers. You can start towards the end of a campaign, and I'd assume your progress picks up as you get later into the game. And if you're playing 1, then you decide to switch. You can't use any of your gear. I'm not sure how you'd make a functional gear set from a gambler. Maybe I've just really been unlucky. And I think this is going to be enough to turn most players off from switching factions. This is another way to do it if you have multiple characters. Because if you have Merchant's Guild gear from a different character, then you're fine. And won't work for your first character, will work for later characters. And since items are giftable, yeah, you could also get a jump start from a friend. This is honestly probably even the best option, because they can find you some exalted stuff, you put it on, you're good to go. You can maintain 2 gear sets to use both regularly, i.e. potentially farm more materials, and then switch over and craft with them. But there's no intended efficiency, so odds are you're not going to actually get more material drops. At least if everything's in balance and everything's perfect, which it probably won't be on the first time, that's totally fine. Is this the only faction system? I mean, I'm guessing no, since they said the first 2. So maybe, but probably not based on trading. Oh, that's a big concerning one. Because this is going to let people trade, get themselves into trouble, and feel locked in where they can't fix their mistakes. I think that all items traded through the Bazaar should be fully resellable. That's one of the best features of the economy in a game like Path of Exile. You are essentially investing in your character or borrowing from the market. Your gear doesn't lose its value just because you equipped it, and this is going to severely limit some people's market participation. I don't think that's a good direction. Can you trade crafted items? Yes. Good. Can you trade crafting materials? No, which is something I'm not really a fan of. I think you should be able to trade at least some, if not most, of the crafting materials. And then, what's the trading currency? Gold. What about face-to-face trading? Can you use items instead? No, only gold. Spoiler alert, yes, you can, because you can just trade an item for 1 gold and then 1 gold. This seems like a really weird limitation to put in. Face-to-face trading, you should probably be able to put up whatever you want in terms of item-for-item stuff. Can you drop trade? No. I guess everything's just going to be instance. That's probably more of a coding limitation. I don't really see a problem with that. Drop trading doesn't need to exist when you can just face-to-face trade anyway. Unless you're going to be locked into a specific price, in which case this is going to be terrible. And I hope you're not locked into a specific price. I hope if I want to give my friend an Orience, I can, just sell it to them for 1 gold. They want to give me, let's just say, a Ravenous Void in exchange. They can just sell that to me for 1 gold. How will the Bazaar system work? Each stall is associated with an item type. Okay. And then you can search through. So it's just an auction house. You buy stuff. You've played ARPGs. You've played MMOs. You know what an auction house looks like. Are solo characters COF by default? No, but basically you shouldn't be anything but COF. Does direct trading cost favor? Yes. Ooh, that's going to come down to the costs. If this is expensive, I'm very much not a fan of that, because that's going to make it very hard to face-to-face trade with friends. Is there a way to sell items with a COF requirement to a MG player? No, that makes sense. The entire point of COF is so that it can't be sold. Will gifted items be able to be regifted? Yes, good. Will every item drop with a faction requirement? No, only COF items. Does progressing towards resonance persist through multiple play sessions? Yes, that makes sense. Don't want to have to play with your friends for 24 hours, leave the game running 24/7. Can an item be gifted or traded after being gifted via a resonance? It can still be gifted to the original owner or players it would have been gifted to before, but it cannot be sold. Fair enough. You really shouldn't resell gifts that you get, especially when, in most cases, people can just trade them to you anyway. What determines the rank required? This is a really good one. For Merchants Guild, the requirement is equal to buying it, basically. Let's see. Legendary items and uniques with legendary potential are the exception, as they only require the regular unique. Cool. So a little more forgiving. I like that. And this is just one less than the rank you were when the item dropped, but is always between 1 and 5. Okay. I'm glad there's the cap, because otherwise most COF items would get capped up to 9, which would be super inconvenient if you ever wanted to swap factions. Though that does mean that you kind of have to get a lot of COF stuff to smoothly swap over, and you can't just get stuff from a friend. So I think this is also quite restrictive. And how will the factions affect the game as a whole? There is a little bit less loot, but once you have a few ranks in COF, it will be about the same as it is now, which is honestly pretty generous. However, with Merchants Guild, you will have unlimited ability to target anything you want and buy it, which is going to be very smooth and very deterministic. Selling items will also give you gold. So overall, I think this is a pretty good first attempt at a system. EHG has explained it well, and now I'm going to get into those thoughts in a little bit more detail. Thus far, the overall reception has been positive, and at least on paper this does seem like a good compromise which will make everyone happy. However, economies, both in the real world and in video games, often have unintended and undesirable interactions because humans are illogical and do things that make little to no sense. The sooner this is tested in a live setting, the better. If this works as intended, players who do not want to trade won't feel forced to. They'll have a path to farm items, and when getting a rare drop can build around it or save it for later. Players who do want to trade can sell unwanted drops, buy the gear they want, and make builds. But I do see a few potential problems with the system, and I want to explore those a bit more. First up, if you primarily trade, but your friend doesn't, you can gift your drops to them, but they can't gift things back to you. This is going to feel especially bad for casual players, doubly so if your friend gets a really rare item, good for your build, that isn't useful to your friend. Now, I don't really have a solution here, because if cross-faction trading like that was enabled, you'd just run an MF account, or an MF character, and gift things back to your main. I don't know if there's a fix here, but it is something that is going to feel bad for some players, so does need to be thought about. Second of all, gold. Gold is largely useless in Last Epoch outside the Lightless Arbor. This means, unless the Lightless Arbor rewards are insane in particular for trade players, there's going to be rampant inflation that may lock newcomers out of the market a couple days or a couple weeks into a cycle, especially because a player can always carry their self-found gold over to their trade character if they start COF early in the cycle. One solution to this would be to make Lightless Arbor particularly rewarding for Merchant Guild members. Basically, at rank 10 maybe, spend your gold to get giga awesome stuff. Another would be to add more gold sinks. A third would be enable the selling of items on the Bazaar for runes or glyphs. These will inherently self-balance via rarity and consumption. For example, Glyph of Despair is used to make some of the best items in the game, thus there's always going to be a demand for it. This is why Path of Exile's economy works so smoothly. All of the currencies players use to trade have innate self-balancing mechanics. People want to destroy them actively to get some sort of benefit, because they're all crafting currencies. The third concern I have is the favor cost, especially when it comes to the Merchant's Guild. Because if you have to grind so much that you'll fully gear out your character, something that's honestly not very hard to do in Last Epoch, before you get the favor required to actually buy gear and gear your character that way, it's going to feel really, really bad. This is especially the case if you're trying to give your friend a jumpstart and they won't have the favor to accept your items. Unless, of course, you're able to pay the favor cost and they just pay the gold. In which case, that's not too bad. But I do think favor costs have to be balanced very carefully, because the entire point of trade is, to an extent, skipping the grind. Again, I'm not saying you should be able to start a fresh character day one and buy perfect gear. But what I am saying is, for your second or third character, if you've been keeping up with a Merchant's Guild, hopefully that favor will be shared, or it will be easy enough to grind that you can buy some basic items, maybe get a full set of decent Exalteds and Uniques, and get your character to the point where it feels good, so you can really start going after those legendaries and chasing the perfection that we all know we should never be able to achieve, but desperately want anyway. And finally, once you buy items, they can't be traded again. And this one is really concerning for me, because a common thing to do in games is essentially borrow an item from trade, i.e. purchase it, use it to test a build, see if you like it, maybe see if it's actually an upgrade for your character, and you know that you can resell it for most, if not all, the value if it doesn't work out. Yes, allowing this would introduce an incentive for people to flip items, but let's be honest, some people find that fun, and that is a form of emergent gameplay which should be supported. Players flipping items is actually a lot less detrimental to the economy than most people think, so long as the economy is not inflationary by nature. But so long as the lightless arbor or other gold sinks are correctly balanced, or a self-balancing currency is used, such as Glyph of Despair, I don't think there's going to be too many people who want to flip in Last Epoch anyway. This is especially problematic when the game's tooltips aren't exactly clear on what is and isn't an upgrade. You might spend a lot of your money on something that you think is going to be super awesome, only to find it's rather mediocre, which is an incredibly frustrating experience, and for many people could be a quit moment if the item's expensive enough. But that said, it's also fairly easy to gear up in Last Epoch, so maybe this last one won't be as big of a concern as I think. Only time will tell, and honestly without seeing the system in action, this is pure speculation on my part. Now, there are a couple things I want to address before I wrap up. Before I do though, if you've been enjoying the video, which let's be honest, you're nearing 30 minutes in, you probably are, you should definitely get subscribed, since I'm going to be making more Last Epoch content and talking about trade and ARPGs broadly many times in the future. In particular, you can look out for a video that's coming soon, giving my full thoughts on the 0.9 multiplayer patch. Now that said, there is one thing I've also heard several times, which I wanted to address, a particular bad faith argument, which is that trade introduces RMT. And yes, okay, if we're getting technical, trade does introduce the possibility of RMT. Just like how having an offline mode introduces the possibility of people editing their save files in offline to gain an advantage and flex on other players. Or just like how having an offline mode makes it easier for cheaters to reverse engineer the game. In most cases though, RMT won't affect your experience. Just like how, in most cases, someone editing their save file won't affect your experience because they just want to make a really cool bow that shoots 80 million projectiles and probably crashes their game, but hey, it's fun till it crashes. Even with just item gifting, there were still going to be ways for RMT to happen. And developers should never make a system to deter cheating, which is so draconian that it has a worse negative impact on the non-cheating players than the cheating itself. Which is exactly what would happen if you locked all items to fixed prices, or simply said no trade because someone might RMT. Also as a note, Last Epoch is not a free-to-play game. For someone to RMT and get banned, they have to then buy a new account, which does help to support the developers. So next time you worry about RMT, don't stress. Just think of it as $40 for EHG. Another thing that I wanted to address is the difference between solo self-found in Last Epoch and solo self-found in Path of Exile. In Path of Exile, the goal of solo self-found is to challenge yourself and play under new and interesting limitations. In Last Epoch, the point of solo self-found, at least if we're talking about COF, is to not engage with trade, to focus on the items that you find. Since a game mode built on the same concept serves a different purpose in Last Epoch, a different solution is required. And I'm glad that 11th Hour Games is trying this. Because solo self-found doesn't always have to be a self-imposed challenge. I do think it's still going to be easier to put builds together as a Merchants Guild member, but if you want to play the game casually and just go through the story, build up a character, fully gear yourself, going COF should be a great way to do it as well. And finally, while it's not really related to trade, I did want to address one other concern that I've seen mentioned several times. 2023 is incredibly packed with ARPG releases, and some people feel that AHG has missed their launch window, and now Last Epoch is doomed to never find success. First off, we don't know. Last Epoch hasn't launched yet, and we don't even have a launch date for 1.0. For all we know, Diablo 4 is going to totally flop, PoE 2 is going to get delayed until 2077, and Last Epoch could launch to very little or no competition. Or Last Epoch could come out in a fairly crowded ARPG market, as yet another live service ARPG. With so many games demanding players' attention, odds are most people aren't going to play all of them. In fact, most people are probably only going to play one or maybe two. But that's the thing. Diablo 4 isn't going to feel like playing Path of Exile. Playing Path of Exile doesn't feel like playing Last Epoch. Different games offer different experiences that will appeal more to some players than others. And so I think Last Epoch can still find its niche. Imagine if someone had told Chris Wilson that Path of Exile shouldn't release because compared to Diablo 3, it never stood a chance. We wouldn't have the ARPG juggernaut that we have today. And to go a little further, I know some people have said that right now Last Epoch is lacking on content, in particular in comparison to Path of Exile, but just remember, Path of Exile's had roughly 10 years of development. Furthermore, a lot of Path of Exile's content has actually been backloaded in the past 4 or so years, as Grinding Gear Games expanded as a company. I expect that D4 will feel like it's lacking content in comparison to Path of Exile. New World felt like it was lacking content in comparison to Path of Exile. And yes, so will Last Epoch. But so long as the content is engaging, and so long as each cycle adds enough to bring players back, I don't think that's a problem because the game's going to be able to build a player base over time. When Josh Strife Hayes interviewed Chris Wilson, I remember Chris mentioned something very interesting. That originally for PoE, they had a target of 10,000 players. That was the number they needed to keep the game development sustainable. I don't know what that number is today. It's probably significantly larger since the company has grown, but I bet that EHG also has a number in mind. And so long as they hit it, anything else doesn't matter. I'm sure their goal is to still grow, to provide an awesome game, and listen to player feedback. Don't let the specter of a perfect ARPG prevent a good game like Last Epoch from getting the attention it deserves. While comments like, "I think it missed its launch window, but I hope they do well," are often made with good intentions, they can still be very damaging. So instead, just hope for the best and trust that 11th Hour Games will do everything possible to make their game succeed. I'd certainly love to sit down with 11th Hour Games, ask them about all this, maybe see if they have any plans for some of these concerns, since it's always better to underpromise and overdeliver. With that said, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this quite long and fairly rambly video. But trade in ARPGs, or video game economies, is one of my favorite topics to talk about, and trade in Last Epoch is especially important to the game's future. If you enjoyed the video, do be sure to leave a like, and let me know your thoughts on the current trade system. Does it fix all the problems, or do you want something else? What are some of the concerns you have in regards to trade in Last Epoch? Leave all that down in the comments below. And of course, before I go, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. If you want something else to watch, maybe check out my Last Epoch build, a Smite Hammerdin that's perfectly appropriate for 0.9. That'll be up in the card and down in the description below. Or of course, you can check out whatever YouTube is recommending, which is on screen right now. That said, thank you for watching. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.